A few weeks ago, I happened to run into a former colleague. It was someone I hadn't been in touch with for a while, but the moment I saw their face, I knew. I knew that something major had happened in the meantime. They said to me, cautiously, "This story. It's fine to put it on air, but please, absolutely do not mention the name of the region. There are still people operating there to this day." I nodded and they slowly began to tell their story. At that time, they were working for an educational company. There was no base salary. It was a system where you were paid only for the classes you taught. So, they didn't have the luxury of picking and choosing their classes, and they said they ran around trying to take on as many as they possibly could. But one day, a student's profile came in. Normally, you'd expect it to list their personality, grades or things to watch out for, right? But that profile was completely blank, apparently. It just had the school, grade, gender and contact info, and everything else was a blank page. They said, honestly, they didn't really want to take it. Because they'd have to go in without knowing anything about the student's environment. Even so, the pay was high. No one else wanted to take it, so the amount kept going up as time passed, and in the end, they accepted the tutoring job thinking, I guess this is something I'm meant to do. On the day of the appointment, they went to the designated address. It turned out that the apartment complex was the most famous one in the region, literally a high-class luxury apartment. Even from the moment of entering by car, the air felt different. The security guard checked the purpose of the visit in minute detail, asking what the subject was and what time the lesson started, and they even had to leave their ID. What was even weirder was that the security guards were unusually young. Young guards, likely in their late 20s to late 30s, were moving around while communicating via what looked like radios. And in the end, they even had to get direct confirmation via the apartment's intercom. The tutor has arrived. May I send them up? Only after all that verification were they finally able to go inside. From that moment on, they already sensed it. Ah, this house is not ordinary at all. After opening the door and entering, they weren't greeted by the lady of the house, but by a housekeeper. They were led deep inside, where the father was sitting at the head of the dining table, the mother next to him, and the student sitting opposite them. Honestly, just that seating arrangement alone would make anyone incredibly nervous, right? They handed over their business card and introduced themselves. But strangely enough, the parents, who had seemed solemn at first, suddenly softened their tone. "Thank you for coming all this way in this heat. Teacher, would you like something to eat?" And instead of the typical, talk about the lessons, they asked a suspicious number of personal questions. Where were they from? Did they live alone? How was their life? There were quite a few such questions, and they said that they even felt a bit more relaxed, thinking, maybe they aren't as scary as I thought. Then, the father said, "Let's start the lessons right now. Normally, you'd have an interview first, do a trial lesson, and go through a final check via the company before beginning the actual tutoring sessions. But this house was suddenly, from now. When the tutor said they hadn't prepared any materials, they were told, we have materials prepared here, so please use those. The lesson that day finished without any particular issues. The student wasn't exceptionally gifted, nor were they trailing far behind. They were just about average. They reacted reasonably well and the lesson was easy to conduct. And so, the tutoring began and without any trouble, it just continued like that. The problem, however, was what happened after that. A few months into the tutoring, the mother contacted them. "I'd like to consult with you about my child." It's hard for a tutor to turn down a request like that. If you listen and respond properly, trust is built, which increases the chances of the tutoring gig lasting a long time. So, they said, understood, and set aside the time. But the mother asked to meet at a cafe a bit far away, not at their home. The tutor wasn't familiar with the area, didn't know the roads well, and the gas money was a concern. Honestly, the round trip was a hassle, but still, if this leads to a long-term tutoring job, it's a plus. Thinking that, they went anyway. That day was the first time they had truly looked at the mother in the cafe, and they were surprised. She was in her 50s, but she was unusually beautiful. It wasn't the polished, new city look you often see. She had a more old-fashioned, strangely alluring atmosphere. The consultation that day started off with the usual stuff. They won't study. It's like their mind is somewhere else. As a tutor, you hear that all the time, even while thinking, here we go again. On the inside, the tutor responded professionally, empathizing, comforting her, and listening intently. But as the conversation dragged on, it slowly started to drift off track. It stopped being about the child and turned into the mother's own life story. Her life so far, things she'd kept buried deep in her chest, words she had never been able to say to anyone. The mother wept as she poured it all out, and the tutor sat there the whole time, listening. And then, the mother said, "Talking to you like this, I feel like I'm really being saved. I've had nowhere else to say things like this. When it gets hard, can I talk to you like this again?" They said that was when they started to waver. Even though they knew, I shouldn't keep this relationship going, they couldn't cut it off. They had already heard too many deep secrets, spent too much time together, and more than anything, the atmosphere, the situation, and everything about her just seemed to pull them in. And so the lessons continued, and the consultations repeated again and again. According to them, that state of affairs lasted for nearly a year. At first, there was guilt, but as time went by, they began to justify it to themselves. I didn't do anything on purpose, and I'm teaching the classes properly. The grades are even going up. Just like that. But one day, the mother contacted them again. "Teacher, can you make some time? There is something I need to consult with you about." The moment that happened, their mind went completely blank. Is something finally going to happen? If the company gets involved, it's over. Defamation, damages. Will everything fall apart? They wanted to run. But they felt that if they ran, it would actually be more dangerous. The tutor decided to steel themselves. "I'll meet with the father and put a firm end to this." When they asked the father for some time, the response they got was, "Let's have dinner together after work, a bit late. I know a place." On the day of the appointment, they headed to the restaurant around 8 p.m. But from the outside, the lights were off. To anyone looking, it appeared closed for business. From that moment on, their heart began to beat even faster. The phone rang. "You've arrived, haven't you? Please, wait just a moment." Immediately after that, who came out was not the father, but a young man. And the inside was even more strange. A silence so profound it felt like they really weren't open. A long stretching hallway. An interior design that looked like a garden made of pebbles and wood. And then, deep in the back, a private room door that looked like it was locked. The door opened, and upon entering, the table was so packed with food that it was sagging under the weight. The father was sitting there, as if nothing were out of the ordinary. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. Let's talk while we eat." The tutor said that, at that moment, they couldn't taste a single thing. And while eating, the father started eating the gejang marinated raw crab. Normally, people eat just the meat bit by bit. But according to the tutor, he ate it as if he were chewing right through the shells. Happily, with a smile on his face. That sight was so grotesque and felt so intensely cold that they didn't know where to look. As they sat there, the father suddenly looked up. At that moment, they caught a glimpse of his mouth and realized it was damaged and festering. The room fell into instant silence, and the tutor couldn't get a word out. "I'm in trouble." That was the only thought that remained in their head. And then, the main issue began. The father said quietly, "There are 3 ways for you, teacher, to resolve this problem. The first, as compensation for the mental distress, just pay 30 million won, clean and simple. The second, if I wanted to extort money, there are plenty of ways to do that later. I have no intention of touching you, so you don't need to worry about that. However, your social life would become a bit difficult. The third." The father said it so naturally as if it were nothing at all. "Lend me your bank account, just for 1 year. An account under a borrowed name, in other words, a burner account." They knew it was illegal too. They knew that the person lending their name would also be punished. But sitting there, their judgment became clouded. If they paid the 30 million won, all their current money would disappear in an instant. The second option, they didn't even want to imagine. The third option, they said a sudden, deceptive thought crossed their mind. "Anyway, if I can just get through today, it might all be over." The father asked, apparently, "How much do you have in your savings account?" The tutor answered in a trembling voice, "I have about 10.3 million won." Then the father said, "Then, hand over 3 million won. For the rest, just lend me the account." And like a business deal, he cut it off cleanly. "Bring it to my shop tomorrow. This ends our connection. Don't ever appear before my eyes again." Right then and there, the tutor had no choice but to nod, just to survive. The next day, they brought the bank book, and since then, there has been no contact at all. About a year later, while they were teaching in a different area, they were at a gathering with colleagues and cautiously brought up that they had been in a dangerous situation before. Suddenly, one of the people there asked them, "Let's go smoke." This was someone who had supposedly already quit smoking. Once they were outside, that person said, That house, I got hit by them too. It was exactly the same. The restaurant. The account. The burner account. The so-called black market account. However, that person had transferred the account, and an incident occurred midway through. They had been investigated by the police and even received a penalty. If that were the case, shouldn't that house be punished too? They just couldn't understand it. So, in the end, they forced down their trauma and went near that restaurant. From a distance. They didn't meet them directly, but the employee who had come out to collect the account was still there, just like before. The restaurant was operating as usual, as if nothing had happened. And there was one more strange detail: the account that was supposed to be used for 1 year and returned had, according to rumors, been abandoned because the shop moved locations after only a few months. Yet, there was no contact. No investigation. Time just passed as if nothing had happened. In the end, they thought to themselves, if I dig any deeper, will my life actually get better? Wouldn't I just be picking at the wound and making it worse? So, they just confirmed it and stopped there. And now, their entire way of working has completely changed. They keep a distance from the start, to the point where mothers might feel they are being a bit cold. Even when asked for consultations, they draw a line. In the end, they said, "This isn't a story about blaming someone else. I'm the one who was wrong. I made a mistake. That's why it's a story that should be quietly swallowed." But nothing has been clearly proven. Even so, when you line up the circumstances, you can't help but think, isn't the same pattern repeating itself over and over? Call the tutor. Close the distance inside the house. Lure them out for a consultation. At the end, a place with no customers, lights off, and a private room with no escape. And then, force them to choose. They didn't call it a ghost, or a curse. But they used a much more unsettling term. They just called it a pattern. If it happens once, it might just be an accident. But the moment the same story comes from different mouths, that is when people finally feel a chill down their spine. I was weak. I was at fault. It's certainly easier to just brush it off that way. But in reality, that easy conclusion might be exactly what the other side wants. So they changed. They threw away all their softness. Keep your distance, handle it only by voice, do not enter the house, do not give them any room to maneuver. And finally, they smiled faintly and said, "More than ghosts, more than money, the thing you have to be most careful about is the gap in your own heart."